Imagine a danger so powerful that it destroys societies more effectively than war, more silently than disease, and more persistently than hatred. A danger that turns ordinary people into willing accomplices of destruction, not because they are evil, but because they have stopped thinking. History shows us that the gravest threat to humanity is not malice, but stupidity, an invisible force that blinds, deafens, and disarms us while convincing us that we see clearly. The question is not whether stupidity exists. The question is, will we recognize it in ourselves before it is too late? There is a danger that hides in plain sight, one that is far more destructive than what we usually fear, and yet we rarely recognize it when it spreads. We imagine evil as our greatest enemy. We believe that when society collapses, it is because of malicious people plotting, scheming, and destroying. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian and resistance thinker who stood against Hitler, gave us a terrifying insight. He argued that evil is not the real danger that breaks societies. Evil can be identified, exposed, resisted. No, the greater danger is stupidity. Not stupidity as an insult, not stupidity as a lack of intelligence, but stupidity as a condition of mind in which people stop thinking for themselves, surrendering their judgment, and repeating slogans that they never questioned. Bonhoeffer wrote from his prison cell as he watched Germany fall into madness. What shocked him was not only the cruelty of the Nazis, but how ordinary people, neighbors, professors, priests, even those who once valued truth, surrendered their independent thought. They did not become villains in their own eyes. They became functionally stupid. He noticed that you could not reason with them. You could not persuade them with evidence. They were not even aware of their surrender. They simply repeated what they were told. And in that surrender, stupidity became more dangerous than evil itself. Because while evil hides and fears being exposed, stupidity marches confidently, convinced of its own righteousness. This is a terrifying theory because it forces us to look not at the few villains in history, but at the many ordinary people who, without malice, allowed cruelty to thrive. When we think of Nazi Germany, we imagine monsters. But Bonhoeffer looked around and saw neighbors, shopkeepers, and scholars transformed into instruments of irrationality. He saw people who were not unintelligent, but who surrendered their capacity for critical thought. That surrender made evil unstoppable. It is easy to imagine that this is only a historical story, but if we look carefully, we see it repeating in different forms throughout history. Consider the Salem witch trials. Entire communities convinced themselves that ordinary women were agents of the devil. People did not wake up intending to kill their neighbors. They simply surrendered to the fear, the slogans, and the groupthink of the moment. Think of the Red Scare in America, when suspicion turned into a collective madness. Think of genocides, persecutions, and mass panics throughout time. Each case reveals the same chilling truth. Most people did not act out of deliberate evil, but out of a surrender to stupidity. Modern psychology confirms what Bonhoeffer saw. In the 1950s, Solomon Asch conducted his famous conformity experiments. Participants were shown lines of different lengths and asked a simple question: which line is the same length as the standard one? The answer was obvious, but when placed in a group where everyone else gave the wrong answer, most participants also gave the wrong answer. They saw the truth with their own eyes, but they conformed to the crowd. They became functionally stupid, not because they lost intelligence, but because they lost independence. Around the same time, Stanley Milgram ran his obedience experiments. Participants were told to administer electric shocks to strangers when instructed by an authority figure. Most people obeyed, even when they believed they were causing real harm. Again, these were not unintelligent people. They were ordinary individuals who abandoned their judgment under pressure. They were swept into what Bonhoeffer would call stupidity. Neuroscience deepens the explanation. Under fear and stress, the human brain shifts from slow, rational thinking to quick, instinctive responses. The prefrontal cortex shuts down, the amygdala takes over, and survival instincts dominate. In such a state, we become far more likely to conform, to obey, to cling to whatever feels safe and certain. It is not stupidity in the sense of low IQ. It is stupidity as surrender, as the shutting down of independent reasoning. Bonhoeffer noticed that stupidity grows most powerfully in groups. Alone, a person might still think critically. But in a crowd, at a rally, in a mob, or in a heated community, individuality dissolves. People begin repeating not their own thoughts, but slogans supplied to them. He wrote that when you talk with such a person, it no longer feels like you are speaking to them at all. You are speaking to the catchphrases that have taken possession of them. Their humanity is still there, but their mind is no longer their own. When we look around today, the parallels are unsettling. Social media has become the most efficient slogan machine in history. It does not simply inform, it amplifies whatever is most repeated. Short, emotional, simplified ideas spread like wildfire. The more they are shared, the more they dominate our perception of truth. And because the platforms reward speed and clicks, falsehood spreads far faster than truth. A study at MIT showed that lies spread 6 times faster than accurate information online. Why? Because lies are simpler, more dramatic, and easier to repeat. People caught in this system often believe they are resisting manipulation. They feel they are independent thinkers. They share slogans with passion, convinced that they are defending truth. But in reality, they are caught in the very stupidity Bonhoeffer described. The condition feels like clarity. It feels like wisdom. It feels like righteousness. And yet it is nothing more than surrender. The danger is that this surrender becomes stubborn. Bonhoeffer noticed that stupidity is not only passive, it defends itself. Once a slogan takes root, the person resists all correction. Arguments bounce off. Evidence is dismissed. Contradictions are ignored. This is why he concluded that stupidity is a greater danger than evil itself. Evil can be exposed and opposed. Stupidity resists exposure, not because it hides, but because it believes itself right. Think about times when you have tried to reason with someone who only repeated phrases they heard from television or social media. You may have felt as if you were speaking to a wall. That futility is exactly what Bonhoeffer described. This is where the theory becomes most disturbing. If stupidity spreads most easily in times of crisis, if it is reinforced by our social structures and even by our own brains, then how can we resist it? Because if we cannot resist it, then perhaps Bonhoeffer was right when he said against stupidity, we are defenseless. And yet, his life shows that he did not give up on resistance. From prison, awaiting execution, he continued to think, to write, to encourage others not to surrender their judgment. His own example suggests that while stupidity is powerful, it is not inevitable. The real question is how we, today, can resist falling into the same surrender. If stupidity spreads most easily in groups and during times of fear, then the question becomes clearer. Why do intelligent people surrender to it so quickly? Why does it seem that the more chaotic the world becomes, the more desperately people cling to the slogans and the voices of authority? The answer lies in the way human beings are wired. We are not designed to be isolated thinkers. We are social creatures built for cooperation, belonging, and survival within the group. Throughout most of history, being excluded from the group was a death sentence. The instinct to conform is ancient, buried deep within our nervous systems. When faced with the choice between belonging and truth, most people choose belonging. This is why people who are otherwise rational will abandon rationality when they sense that it threatens their social standing. A scientist may dismiss inconvenient data if it risks their career. A citizen may repeat a political slogan they do not fully believe in, simply to avoid confrontation. A religious leader may overlook cruelty simply to preserve unity within their community. Each of these people may privately sense contradictions, but the pull of conformity is stronger than the pull of truth. And once the group has decided what truth is, questioning it feels like betrayal. The brain reinforces this pressure. Psychological experiments reveal that when we agree with our peers, the brain's reward centers light up. Agreement feels good. Disagreement triggers discomfort, even pain. This explains why cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of holding conflicting beliefs, pushes us to align with the group rather than risk being the outlier. People do not merely avoid conflict out of fear. They avoid it because conformity feels natural and dissent feels unnatural. But what begins as a social instinct soon becomes a moral one. Bonhoeffer observed that people caught in stupidity often believe they are doing the right thing. They see themselves as virtuous, loyal, faithful, patriotic. The slogans they repeat give them a sense of moral purpose. This makes stupidity doubly dangerous. It is not only resistant to reason, it is armored by righteousness. To question it is not simply to challenge an idea, but to challenge the person's sense of self and their community. This is why reasoning often fails. It is not an argument over facts. It is a struggle over belonging, over identity, over the deep human need to feel right. When societies fall into this condition, leaders quickly learn to exploit it. They do not need to persuade everyone with careful arguments. They only need to create an atmosphere where independent thinking feels impossible. By flooding the world with slogans, by rewarding loyalty over truth, by punishing dissenters, they encourage people to surrender willingly. And once people surrender, they are easier to control than if they had been coerced by force. History is filled with examples. In Germany, it was not only fear of the Gestapo that kept people in line. It was the atmosphere of conformity, the pressure to repeat what everyone else was repeating, the fear of appearing disloyal. In Salem, it was not only the threat of punishment that drove accusations of witchcraft. It was the mass panic that made suspicion feel like duty. During the Cold War, Americans often turned against one another, not because they personally believed their neighbors were traitors, but because suspicion had become the atmosphere of loyalty. This pattern is not confined to the past. In our present age, we see the same forces at work in new forms. Social media has perfected the mechanics of collective stupidity. It amplifies emotion over reason, speed over depth, certainty over humility. Outrage spreads because outrage is simple, repeatable, and contagious. A complex truth takes time to understand, but a slogan can be repeated in seconds. And once enough people repeat it, the slogan begins to feel like reality. This is why misinformation spreads so easily. It is not just that people fail to check facts. It is that misinformation is often more emotionally satisfying than truth. It gives people villains to blame, heroes to worship, certainty in a confusing world, and once repeated, it becomes harder and harder to challenge. People feel personally attacked when their slogans are questioned. They are defending not just ideas, but their very sense of belonging. The danger of this condition is that it does not require malice. People caught in it may believe they are protecting society, defending morality, preserving truth. But in reality, they are repeating words that are not their own. Bonhoeffer described it as a kind of possession. The person is still there, but their speech has been taken over by slogans. They no longer argue. They echo. They no longer think. They repeat. and yet they believe themselves to be awake, aware, righteous. This is why he said stupidity is a greater danger than evil. Evil knows what it is doing. Evil must disguise itself. Evil fears being discovered. But stupidity, convinced of its own virtue, marches boldly into destruction. A single malicious person can be confronted. A system filled with stupidity cannot. Logic does not work. Evidence does not work. Even suffering often does not break through. Because as long as people cling to the group, as long as the slogans feel like safety, they will double down. If this is true, then we must ask the most urgent question of all: is there any hope of resisting this condition? If stupidity spreads faster than reason, if it thrives in fear, if it rewards conformity and punishes dissent, how can individuals possibly resist it? The answer is difficult. Bonhoeffer himself admitted that against stupidity we are nearly defenseless. But his own life, his own choices, suggest that resistance, while costly, is still possible. He believed that the first step toward resistance is recognizing that stupidity is not an intellectual problem, but a moral one. It is not solved by giving people more information. It is solved by giving them courage. Because people often know the truth deep down. They see contradictions, they feel unease. But they lack the strength to stand apart, to risk exclusion. Resistance, then, begins with the courage to remain independent even when independence is costly. This courage does not mean rejecting all community. It means refusing to let community replace thought. It means being willing to live with discomfort, to tolerate uncertainty, to remain loyal to truth rather than to slogans. And above all, it means resisting the seduction of certainty. Certainty feels safe, but it is often the mask of stupidity. Truth is harder, slower, less clear. But only truth frees us from the slogans that enslave the mind. At this point, the speech must turn toward hope, toward the possibility of reclaiming independent thought. Because if we stop here, we remain trapped in Bonhoeffer's darkest conclusion. In the final part, we will turn to what it means to resist, not with arrogance, but with humility and courage. We will ask what it takes to keep the mind free in an age when everything, from politics to technology to fear itself, tries to enslave it. If stupidity is more dangerous than evil, if it spreads in groups and thrives in fear, if it transforms ordinary people into instruments of destruction while convincing them they are righteous, then the most pressing challenge of our time is how to resist it. And yet, resistance is never easy, because stupidity does not feel like stupidity to the person who has succumbed to it. It feels like clarity. It feels like loyalty. It feels like certainty. That is why Bonhoeffer insisted that arguments alone are not enough. The problem is not a lack of intelligence or access to information, but a willingness to stop thinking when thinking becomes painful or dangerous. The first act of resistance is to reclaim solitude. Stupidity thrives in crowds because the crowd relieves us of the burden of thinking for ourselves. When everyone around you repeats the same slogans, it becomes easier to echo them than to examine them. In solitude, the echo fades, and the mind begins to reawaken. Solitude does not mean isolation, but it means creating the space to ask, do I truly believe this, or am I merely repeating it? Do I understand this, or am I simply conforming? Many of history's greatest resistors found strength in silence and reflection. Bonhoeffer himself, imprisoned and cut off from his community, wrote with a clarity that still unsettles us today. The second act of resistance is humility. To believe we are immune to stupidity is to fall into it. The reality is that no one is safe. The most educated professors, the most brilliant scientists, the most articulate writers, all have been swept into the tides of conformity. What protects us is not intelligence but humility, the recognition that we too can be deceived. This humility changes the way we approach disagreement. Instead of seeing opponents as enemies, we see them as warnings of what could happen to us. Instead of assuming we hold the truth, we test our beliefs against reality, knowing that error is always possible. The third act is courage. Resistance will always demand a price, because stupidity protects itself by punishing dissent. To stand apart is to risk exclusion, ridicule, and even persecution. Bonhoeffer's life was proof of this. He chose to speak, to act, to resist, and for that he was imprisoned and executed. But he showed that resistance, even when crushed, carries a meaning that outlives the individual. Courage is not about certainty. It is about standing firm even when the outcome is unclear, even when the cost is high. Without courage, truth remains powerless. With courage, even one voice can plant doubt in a system built on slogans. Resistance also requires daily practice, not just heroic moments. Stupidity spreads through ordinary acts, the careless sharing of misinformation, the uncritical acceptance of authority, the silence when falsehoods are repeated. Likewise, resistance spreads through ordinary acts, the refusal to share without checking, the willingness to pause before reacting, the choice to ask questions even when answers are uncomfortable. Every time we choose curiosity over certainty, every time we slow down instead of rushing to repeat, every time we admit, "I do not know," instead of pretending to know, we chip away at the system that rewards intellectual surrender. Communities must also be rebuilt. If stupidity flourishes in groups, then wisdom must be cultivated in groups as well. But these groups must not be echo chambers of conformity. They must be communities where disagreement is possible, where truth is pursued collectively rather than dictated from above. Such communities are fragile because they require patience, listening, and trust. Yet they are also the seed of resilience. When people gather not to chant slogans but to think together, to argue honestly, to test ideas without fear, they create an atmosphere where stupidity cannot easily take root. Memory is another form of resistance. Stupidity thrives when societies forget. Forgetting turns past horrors into future mistakes. The phrase, "never again," loses its meaning when people no longer remember what "again" refers to. Bonhoeffer's writings are a reminder of this. They force us to recall how quickly an educated, cultured society surrendered to destructive stupidity. They remind us that civilization is never safe, that the fall into conformity is always a possibility. By remembering, we preserve the warnings that future generations will need. Without memory, resistance is impossible because we cannot resist what we do not recognize. But perhaps the most unsettling realization is that our own minds are not neutral. They are built to prefer speed over accuracy, belonging over truth, certainty over doubt. These instincts once helped us survive, but in the modern world they betray us. The systems we have built, social media, political campaigns, entertainment industries, exploit these instincts with surgical precision. Algorithms do not simply show us what is true. They show us what keeps us engaged, outraged, certain, loyal. They turn our weaknesses into profits. In this environment, resisting stupidity requires more than individual strength. It requires structural change. That change must begin with transparency. Platforms that shape our information must reveal how they operate, how they select what we see, how they profit from our attention. Without this, we remain at the mercy of systems designed to keep us reactive rather than reflective. We also need education that goes beyond skills and facts, education that teaches people how to question, how to recognize manipulation, how to live with uncertainty. A society that does not train its citizens to think critically is a society preparing itself for stupidity. And finally, we need economic security, because people overwhelmed by fear and scarcity have little energy left for independent thought. A world where survival consumes every waking moment is a world where intellectual surrender becomes inevitable. None of this guarantees success. Bonhoeffer himself did not live to see victory. He died in the shadow of defeat. Yet his words remain, and perhaps that is the greatest form of resistance. To leave behind a testimony, a reminder, a warning, that is itself an act of defiance against stupidity, because stupidity depends on silence. It depends on people giving up their ability to remember, to think, to speak. By writing, by preserving his insights, Bonhoeffer ensured that stupidity could never fully erase the truth. So where does that leave us today? It leaves us with the same question Bonhoeffer asked from his cell: who stands fast? When conformity is easy and thinking is costly, who stands fast? When slogans spread like fire and truth is buried beneath noise, who stands fast? When belonging demands silence and conscience demands speech, who stands fast? The answer is not found in superior intelligence or special education. It is found in the willingness to remain curious rather than certain, humble rather than arrogant, courageous rather than comfortable. It is found in the daily choice to think, even when thinking hurts. It is found in the recognition that the moment we believe ourselves immune, we have already begun to surrender. Perhaps the most radical act of all in an age of artificial certainty is to say, "I do not know." To admit ignorance is to open the door to learning. To admit uncertainty is to open the door to dialogue. To admit vulnerability is to open the door to wisdom. These small acts may seem powerless, but they are seeds of resistance, because they refuse the false comfort of stupidity. The tragedy is that stupidity often feels like liberation. It feels easier to stop thinking, to let the group decide, to surrender to the slogans. But as Bonhoeffer warned, the price of this surrender is our very humanity. To give up thinking is to give up being fully human. Resistance, then, is not about heroism. It is about survival, of truth, of dignity, of freedom itself. The challenge remains. In a world where every system profits from our surrender, will we choose the harder path of independence? Will we slow down when everything urges us to react? Will we remain curious when certainty tempts us? Will we stand fast when the crowd demands silence? These are not questions we answer once. They are questions we must answer every day, in every choice, in every thought. So I leave you with the same challenge Bonhoeffer left his readers. Will you keep thinking when thinking becomes inconvenient, uncomfortable, or costly? Will you defend the possibility of truth, not by claiming certainty, but by refusing surrender? In the end, the battle against stupidity is not fought with weapons or protests, but with the courage to keep thinking in a world that wants you to stop.